Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a story that really shook the Yale community and I think left a lasting impact on everybody who heard about it, the murder of Annie Lowe. We've got some really interesting sources about this case, and we're not only going to kind of like explore what happened, but also I think try to understand the environment where this all took place.
Yeah, it's a case that goes beyond sort of the usual true crime,
Yeah.
It's especially fascinating because it reveals so much about the dynamics of a high-pressure academic world.
Right, because you'd think Yale would be this haven of intellectual pursuit, but as we're going to see, even there, things can go terribly wrong.
Yeah.
So who was Annie Lowe? From what I've read, she was incredibly accomplished, like a real rising star.
Oh, she was. She was born to Vietnamese immigrant parents and raised by her aunt and uncle in California. Even in high school, she was exceptional. I mean, her classmates nicknamed her the next Einstein, and she graduated as valedictorian.
The next Einstein. Wow. I mean, that's some serious praise there. It seems like she was destined for great things.
She certainly was on that path. Annie earned a full scholarship to the University of Rochester, where she majored in cellular and developmental biology. But what's interesting is that she wasn't just driven academically. I mean, she was really involved in her community, volunteering at a soup kitchen and active in her church.
So it wasn't just achievements. She really cared about people. I mean, it makes this whole story even more tragic.
It does. And then in 2007, she went to Yale for a PhD program in pharmacology. She was doing groundbreaking research on things like metabolic disorders, cancer, and diabetes.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. And she was only in her 20s. It's hard to even fathom the loss, especially knowing her character and potential.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more poignant is this article that she wrote for a Yale publication about campus safety. She was urging her fellow students to be careful, especially because Yale is in an urban environment.
It's like a terrible twist of fate, almost.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so let's talk about the day she disappeared. September 8th, 2009, just 5 days before her wedding. Can you walk me through what happened?
Well, Annie was at her lab in Sterling Hall early that morning, like usual. She left her stuff in her office and went to another building, 10 Amistad Street, to check on some mice that she was using for her research.
Okay.
We know this from electronic key records showing that she entered the lab at 10 a.m. Surveillance footage even shows her going in wearing a brown skirt and the screen T-shirt. But there's no record of her ever leaving.
So she just vanished. What did the police initially think happened? I mean, a case like this must have sent shockwaves through the entire campus.
Oh, absolutely. Initially, the police investigated all sorts of possibilities. Maybe she was having pre-wedding jitters, or maybe she just decided to leave, unexpectedly. They even searched the Hartford dump where Yale's trash was taken. I mean, that just shows how extensive the search was.
That's crazy. Searching a whole dump, it really shows how baffling her disappearance must have been.
Right.
Did they ever consider her fiancé as a suspect?
Of course, he was questioned, but they quickly ruled him out. Everyone who knew them said they were totally in love and very excited about their wedding. It wasn't a case of cold feet or a troubled relationship.
Okay, so if it wasn't her fiancé, who did they start looking at? I'm guessing things probably took a dark turn when they actually found Annie's body.
You're right. The nature of the crime scene itself was a major clue. The lab was a secure area with keycard access and security guards.
Right.
And this told investigators that the perpetrator most likely knew the building and how the security worked. Someone with authorized access.
It's like a locked room mystery almost. It definitely narrows down the suspects.
Exactly. And then they found bloody clothes hidden above a ceiling tile in the lab. Eventually, a German shepherd brought in to help search actually led them to Annie's body, hidden within the walls of the lab's basement.
Oh my God, that's chilling. It sounds like something out of a crime novel. So who did the evidence point to at that stage?
Well, all signs started pointing towards Raymond Clark III, a lab technician who worked in the same building as Annie. He was known for being really meticulous, almost to a fault, especially when it came to following lab protocols. He also had a bit of a reputation for being abrasive, and he had clashed with researchers, including Annie, about how to care for the lab animals.
So there was already tension between them. It seems like something seemingly minor, like caring for lab animals, could actually be masking a much deeper conflict.
That's a great point. This town versus gown dynamic you mentioned earlier was very much alive and well in the lab. Lab techs are responsible for the animals and enforcing rules, but the researchers, they often see themselves as, occupying a different, sort of more prestigious world.
It's like they're on different levels of the academic hierarchy, which could easily breed resentment. Did the sources say anything specific about how researchers treated lab techs?
Yes, actually, one source mentioned that researchers often saw lab techs as glorified janitors, which is pretty demeaning.
Wow.
It gives you an idea of the power imbalance, you know?
That's rough. It's easy to see how that kind of attitude could create a hostile work environment. So were there any other red flags about Raymond Clark?
Well, his ex-girlfriend described him as controlling and sometimes even violent.
Oh, wow.
And this sort of painted a picture of a potentially volatile individual, someone capable of lashing out.
So it sounds like they had a potential suspect with a possible motive and access to the crime scene. What kind of hard evidence did they have linking him to Annie's murder?
Well, the DNA evidence was really damning. They found Annie's blood on a pair of boots with his name on them, her hair was found on his clothes, and his DNA matched samples found on Annie's body and clothing. I mean, it's pretty conclusive.
Wow, that's a lot of evidence pointing at him. What was his reaction when he was confronted with all of this? Did he admit to anything?
Initially, he denied seeing Annie at all on the day of the murder, which, was a lie that quickly unraveled. He even agreed to a polygraph test, which he failed miserably, especially when asked about Annie's whereabouts.
So he basically dug himself into a deeper hole. What happened next? Did he finally confess?
Not exactly. It was that point, realizing he was cornered, that he requested a lawyer, ending the interrogation. But it was too late. On September 17th, Raymond Clark III was arrested at a motel where he was hiding out, and he was charged with Annie's murder.
Wow, what a turn of events. So what happened after his arrest? Did he go to trial? This is where things must get really complicated, right?
You're right. The case moved into the legal system. And that's where things took another interesting turn.
So we left off with Raymond Clark's arrest for the murder of Annie Liza. What happened next? Did he confess or maintain his innocence?
It's kind of interesting, actually. He initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence against him kind of piled up, he ended up changing his plea to what's called an Alford plea.
An Alford plea? I'm not familiar with that. What does that even mean?
It's a really fascinating legal strategy. It means that he didn't admit guilt outright, but he acknowledged that the evidence was strong enough that he would likely be convicted. So he was basically accepting the consequences without actually confessing.
That's a pretty strategic move. So what did he plead guilty to?
He pleaded guilty to murder and attempted sexual assault.
Attempted sexual assault. That's the first time we're hearing about that. Was this something that came out during the investigation?
It's not totally clear from the sources if this was a charge that came up later or if it was always part of the case, but just not highly publicized. It definitely adds another layer of, complexity and horror to this already tragic story.
It does. It makes that Alford plea even more perplexing. If he wasn't going to admit guilt, why plead guilty to a charge that wasn't explicitly proven?
That's the question, isn't it? It leaves a lot of unanswered questions,
Huh.
especially about his motive.
Right. Okay, so he entered this Alford plea. What was his sentence?
He was sentenced to 44 years in prison.
44 years. That's a long time. Did he ever offer an explanation for his actions? A motive for the murder? You'd think at that point he might have wanted to clear the air.
No, and that's one of the most frustrating aspects of this case. At his sentencing, he did express remorse and apologize to Annie's family,
Wow.
but he never revealed why he did it.
So he took the secret to prison with him. That must have been so incredibly difficult for Annie's family to never have that closure.
Absolutely. The sources describe the sentencing hearing as just incredibly emotional. Both Annie's and Clark's families were present in the courtroom, and you can only imagine the raw grief and pain that was in that room.
I can only imagine. Did any of Annie's family members speak at the sentencing?
Yes. Her mother, Vivian, she addressed Clark directly. She talked about the devastating loss of her only daughter, saying, "You took away my only daughter. Her future is gone. Her life is gone. Society has lost a beautiful woman. My family has lost a beautiful soul."
God, those words are just heartbreaking. You can really feel the weight of her grief.
Yeah, and it really highlights the ripple effect of this crime. It wasn't just Annie's life that was taken. It was her entire family's future that was shattered. All those hopes and dreams gone.
So the criminal proceedings ended with Clark's sentencing. But did the legal battles end there?
Not quite. Annie's family considered filing a civil lawsuit, potentially against Yale University itself.
Against Yale. That's interesting. What would be the basis of a lawsuit against the university?
Well, the sources don't go into much detail, but it's possible that they were looking into whether Yale could be held liable for failing to prevent the crime.
I see. Maybe they felt that Yale could have done more to ensure the safety of its students and employees. especially given the tensions we've discussed between researchers and lab techs. Like, was there negligence on their part?
It's a plausible theory. The case definitely brought up questions about workplace safety and the responsibility institutions have to, address potential conflicts or power imbalances that could lead to violence.
It also makes you wonder if things might have turned out differently had there been better communication between the researchers and lab techs, a greater sense of respect and understanding.
Right. What if there had been a more collaborative and less hierarchical environment in the lab? Could those tensions that maybe contributed to the tragedy have been addressed before things escalated? It's something to think about.
It is. It makes you want to examine your own workplace and think, are we fostering an environment of respect and open communication? Are we addressing conflicts before they become something bigger?
Absolutely. This case really highlights that seemingly minor disputes, if they're not dealt with properly, they can fester and turn into something much more dangerous.
We often hear that saying, never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence. But sometimes it's a bit of both, right?
Often it is. In this case, we'll never know for sure what combination of factors led to Annie's murder. But it seems pretty clear that the town versus gown dynamic, the power imbalances, the communication breakdowns, and perhaps even Clark's own personal demons all played a role.
It's a lot to unpack. And we can't forget the intense media coverage this case received. It was a national story, wasn't it? I remember hearing about it, even though I wasn't living anywhere near Yale at the time.
Oh, you're right. It quickly became a national news story, capturing the attention of the media and the public. I mean, the circumstances were just so shocking and intriguing, right? A young, promising student found murdered in a prestigious university lab. It really challenged the perception of safety and security within those Ivy League walls.
Yeah, I can see why it grabbed headlines. It kind of plays on a lot of our fears and anxieties about seemingly safe spaces not being as safe as we think. Did the media coverage focus on any particular aspects of the case?
Yes, a few themes really stood out. Of course, there was a lot of focus on Annie Lee herself, her accomplishments, her personality, and the tragic loss of her potential. That really resonated with people.
It's a classic story that grabs our attention, a young life cut short. What other angles did the media explore?
Well, they also really honed in on that town versus gown dynamic we discussed earlier. The media speculated that those tensions between researchers and lab technicians might have played a significant role in Annie's murder.
Did they find any evidence to support that theory?
Well, while there wasn't a direct link between the crime and those broader social tensions, the case definitely highlighted those complexities of relationships within a lab environment, and how seemingly minor misunderstandings and resentments can simmer beneath the surface.
It's interesting. We've talked about potential negligence on Yale's part, but what about individual responsibility? Where do we draw the line between systemic issues and personal choices?
That's a crucial question, and one that's not easily answered. It's like trying to untangle a knotted thread. In this case, you have the who and the how clearly laid out, but the why remains elusive. And without that piece of the puzzle, it's tough to fully comprehend the tragedy and learn from it.
That's what makes this case so haunting. We can examine the evidence, analyze the motives, explore the societal context, but ultimately, we're left with a gaping hole in our understanding.
It's true. And while we may never know for certain what drove Raymond Clark to commit this horrific act, we can still examine the factors that contributed to the tragedy and use them as a springboard for discussions about workplace dynamics, communication, and conflict resolution.
That's a good point. Even without a clear motive, there's still a lot we can learn from this case. Maybe it's less about finding that one definitive answer and more about recognizing the complex web of factors that can lead to such a horrific event.
Exactly. Annie Lem's murder was a senseless tragedy, but by examining it thoughtfully, we can start to think about how to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future.
It's really strange, as we've been discussing this case and all the details of the crime, one thing that keeps coming back to me is just the sheer randomness of it all. It's almost like a perfect storm of, unfortunate events just colliding at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, there's this chilling sense of how easily things could have gone differently. If Annie hadn't been in the lab that day, if Raymond Clark had been in a different mood, or if someone else had been around to, intervene, the outcome could have been totally different.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Just realizing how much of our lives hinge on those small, seemingly insignificant moments and, chance encounters. It's almost as if fate itself played a role in this whole thing.
Well, it's a natural human response, right?
Oh.
When we're confronted with something as senseless as this, We try to find meaning. We look for those patterns or explanations that can help us make sense of the chaos. But sometimes those answers just aren't there.
And I think that's what makes this case so haunting. We can analyze all the evidence, we can dissect the motives, explore the societal context, but ultimately, we're left with this, gaping void in our understanding. We may never truly know what drove Raymond Clark to commit such a horrific act, and that's a difficult thing to accept.
It is. And it's in that space of uncertainty, of all those unanswered questions, that we're often forced to confront some pretty profound truths.
What do you mean by that? What can we learn from the things we don't know?
Well, it forces us to acknowledge the limits of what we know, right?
Ah.
The complexity of human behavior and this sort of uncomfortable reality that even in the most seemingly, controlled environments, things can still go terribly wrong. Tragedy can strike anyone, anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, that's a really powerful insight. It is humbling to realize that we don't have all the answers. And even with all our advancements and, all our science and technology, there are still dark corners of the human experience that we may never fully understand.
Exactly. And it's in those dark corners that we need to be the most vigilant, the most aware of our own vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of the people around us.
So, reflecting on everything we've discussed, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive? What can we learn from Annie's story, even in the absence of a clear motive?
I think the most important takeaway is the need for empathy and compassion, not just in our personal lives, but in every interaction we have. We need to be more aware of what other people are going through, more willing to listen to them, and more proactive in trying to understand perspectives that are different from our own.
It's about creating a culture of respect, right? Where everyone feels seen and heard, no matter their background or position, where conflicts are addressed openly and honestly and not allowed to, simmer and potentially blow up.
Exactly. And it's about fostering a sense of community,
Yeah.
where we look out for each other, offer support when it's needed, and just create those environments where everyone feels safe and valued.
Yeah, it's a tall order, but it feels essential if we want to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Annie Love's death was a senseless loss, but maybe her story can serve as a catalyst for some positive change. Maybe a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding can have, a ripple effect.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. This deep dive has been a sobering reminder of how fragile life really is and the importance of creating healthy and supportive environments in all aspects of our lives.
It really has. And while we may never fully understand the why behind this tragic event, there are valuable lessons to be learned about the importance of empathy, communication, and building a world where these tragedies become less, not more likely.
I couldn't agree more. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has provided you with not just a better understanding of this particular case, but also a renewed sense of the importance of empathy, communication, and building a world where tragedies like this become less, not more, likely.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and reflection. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep striving to make the world a little bit better, one conversation at a time.